Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. In last week's edition, we brought you part one of our profile of retired U.S. Army Green Beret, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann. We discussed his nearly 23 years in uniform, most of it in Special Forces, and the many years he spent in Afghanistan building trust with the Afghan people. Last week, Colonel Mann sat down with us for a second time to discuss how he and other veterans coordinated the evacuation of their closest Afghan friends and allies, and ultimately hundreds of others who were loyal to the United States. The mission was called the Pineapple Express and managed to get hundreds of allies onto planes and safely out of Afghanistan in those final chaotic days before the U.S. military completed its withdrawal. Before we get to that mission, we need to back up a bit to Colonel Mann's time on active duty. During his early days as a Green Beret, his focus was in Latin America. And while that is about as far as you can get from Afghanistan, the lessons he learned on those early assignments would serve him well and play an important role in building relationships through the military's village stability operations.
Well, working by, with, and through our allies is something that I was taught at a very early age as a young Green Beret growing up in 7th Special Forces Group, where we worked primarily Latin America in the 90s during the drug war, and I was fortunate enough to be mentored by these amazing Green Beret sergeants who had spent their whole life in 7th Special Forces Group working in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and they built relationships with the Ecuadorian soldiers. From the time they were privates, they would train these young soldiers, and then those soldiers would go on to become, senior NCOs, sergeants, major, generals. And it was astounding to me to watch these Green Beret sergeants from my unit who could go down to Ecuador, could go down to Lima, Peru, and they would have such a deep relationship with the most senior foreign officers and foreign NCOs. And they could get so much done. Just one or two Special Forces NCOs, and I was enamored with that. I was enamored with the power of relationships and social currency, social capital, as a way to get things done. Because we had no authority over the Ecuadorian army, but yet the relationships that were in place could leverage amazing things to get done in the interest of national security and regional security. And so for me, I took a lot of that into Afghanistan. For me, it was, and I think that's not unique to me, that's most Green Berets that I've known, understood the value of social capital, those tangible linkages that exist between humans, because we're social creatures. We're actually designed to navigate the world through our relationships. And so, I really brought an appreciation for that into Afghanistan. The first 10 years, I didn't do a good job of it. I don't think we did a good job as a coalition. We were focused, again, more on walking the enemy down and projecting our top-down agenda that did not reflect local reality. But the latter 10 years of the war, I feel like we did work very closely with the Afghan people. I found myself going village to village with Village Stability Program, and I would ask Afghan elders, I would ask questions like, what was life like before the Soviet Union came to your country? And we would be sitting under a mulberry tree and their eyes would kind of mist over, and you could just see that they would go back to a different time. They would go back to a time 40 years prior where, there was peace in the land and there had not been war, and they would go to the mosque on Friday with their families and have picnics, and, the elders would resolve disputes and everybody helped with the farming, and it was a different time. And in those conversations, they would give us the answers that they were looking for what stability looked like in their community, for what life looked like in their community when it was at its finest. And, for me, that was a big deal. It was like, in a lot of ways, sitting down with my grandfather and hearing about the times when, he was a kid and what he valued. And it really taught me the importance of sitting down with people and understanding what they valued at a local level. Context is everything, right? I mean, in this crazy world that we run in, 90 miles an hour, mass technology, we don't take a lot of time to just sit down with people at a local level and find out what they value. I call it meeting them where they are, not where you want them to be. And that's really the essence of the book Game Changers. It's really the essence of the village stability approach. And I like to think that it's what I took away from the Afghan war and what they taught me. The Afghan people taught me at a very, very local level, which was the importance of what happens in a community and understanding it and putting value on it and starting at that place.
The village stability operations were a huge success, but even as Colonel Mann left Afghanistan a couple of years later, he could see U.S. policy heading in the wrong direction. And he knew that would mean a more difficult future for our mission there and for the Afghan people.
When I left Afghanistan in 2010 for the last time as a soldier, what I expected was actually, I was kind of losing some degree of, actually it was, I left Afghanistan, it was more like 2012. I'd gone over to check on the village stability program, and I was kind of getting disillusioned, somewhat frustrated, because it was very clear to me that the government was moving back toward the top-down approach. We were pulling teams out of the villages. We were not going to go this long route of by, with, and through and helping Afghans stand up on their own, because it's not as sexy. It takes longer. You know, we had said from the beginning it's probably going to take 75 years to help restore some of the losses to informal civil society. The farming practices had been decimated by the Soviets. The dispute resolution practices had been decimated by the Civil War. There had been an entire generation of oral storytelling that had just been wiped out because the elders were killed. So it was going to take a long time. And frankly, America doesn't have that patience. The coalition didn't seem to have that patience. Our military didn't have that patience. And so I felt, kind of disillusioned. I kind of felt like this isn't going to go the way it needs to go. And what's happening now in the country, in my mind, was predictable, because we were cutting out the realities of what the Afghan people valued, and we were trying to go back to this preferred Western way of war, of projecting our ideals and goals on another culture that just simply was not ready to receive them. So I was getting very, very concerned about how this was going to end.
The relationships formed over those years in Afghanistan continued to flourish even after Colonel Mann was long gone. He says he maintained very close friendships with interpreters, villagers, and other critical support personnel.
I maintained a lot of contact with the people in Afghanistan because they're like my second home. I spent so much time there. I built such deep relationships there. I was writing a book on Afghanistan. And frankly, what I teach in my rooftop leadership and in my nonprofit, The Hero's Journey, is derived from the lessons I learned in Afghanistan, and more importantly, the things that a lot of the Afghan people taught me. I have deep relationships with, former cultural advisors and their families, village elders who had mentored me. So a lot of contact. I helped several of my cultural advisors and their families get over to the United States on special immigration visas after they were targeted. So there were a lot of reasons to stay connected to Afghanistan, and I did that on a range of levels. I even went back over as a civilian at the invitation of General Miller at that time, who was over there with the task force to finish up my book, Game Changers. I wanted to finish it there and get my eyes on the country and where it was going. So I maintained a close contact with that country and her people over the years.
In 2020, the Trump administration forged a tentative deal with the Taliban that would lead to the full withdrawal of American forces, so long as the Taliban met its obligations. The Biden administration came in early 2021, and within months changed the withdrawal date from May 1st to September 11th. And eventually back to August 31st of 2021. Even before the Taliban began conquering Afghanistan at a rapid pace, Colonel Mann was very uneasy with the withdrawal plans.
I was not a fan. I think one of the things that goes on when presidential administrations and politicians talk about Afghanistan, or probably any war for that matter, they're very loath to own the problem. And this is where I think veterans get really upset, is because politicians start and end wars. Militaries fight them on behalf of the politicians. But it's very rare that you'll see a politician who will own the problem. Like they won't stand up like veterans do and we say, okay, the first 10 years we made a mistake, here's where we did, and this is what we did to change it. You'll seldom see a politician do that. And I think with Afghanistan, you see this, like where the Trump administration, and in my book, Game Changers, I talk about really every administration that prosecuted the war on terror from 9/11 onward was underwhelming to me. I don't think that they showed up with the kind of leadership and, frankly, technical and tactical prowess around the Afghan problem and the Iraq problem that was worthy of the men and women who fought it. Am I making sense? Because they went deep. The people who fought this war got pretty deep on the problem. The politicians who nominated the war and who kept it going really didn't. They were superficial on it. They were casual about it. They were pedestrians in their understanding of the war. There were a few exceptions, but not many. So now you look at, for example, when things started to fall apart, really fall apart, I think it was under the Trump administration. I think that the approach that they took to the negotiations, I think they were exclusionary. I think that they left out some critical people, namely the Afghan government. I think that it was approached more as a business deal than a true negotiation for peace. And I think that had there been even a fundamental understanding of how things work in that country, you would not have had what the Biden administration then executed on, right? So I do believe the Biden administration owns every bit of what happened with this debacle. But the Trump administration doesn't get a pass either, because their negotiations leading up to it, their desire to get rapidly out of the country with no stay-behind capacity for helping communities, reflects their lack of knowledge or even will to do the right thing as it pertained to Afghanistan and the 20 years of sacrifice that our community put into it. And no one's going to change my mind on that. Like, I look at this problem deeply. I've studied this problem for 2 decades, and I found the politicians who prosecuted this war to be severely underwhelming.
When we come back, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and the Pineapple Express is born. Stay with us. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. In this edition, we are bringing you part 2 of our conversation with retired U.S. Army Green Beret Lt. Colonel Scott Mann. And we're discussing his role in helping to rescue hundreds of Afghan allies through the mission known as the Pineapple Express. It was mid-August 2021 that the world saw the collapse of Afghanistan, but the Afghan people saw it coming long before that. By the time President Biden assured the world in July that the Taliban return to power was not inevitable, Colonel Mann was already getting messages of desperation and fear from his Afghan friends and allies.
Regardless of what the Biden administration was saying in July of 2021, that the country of Afghanistan was going to hold, things would be fine, I was getting texts from a dear friend of mine named Nizam, who was a former Special Forces and commando in the Afghan Army, who I had known since 2010. I had trained him, I'd gone to combat with him, and he was in hiding in Kabul already. And he was saying, Herat has fallen. The Kandahar prison has been raided. The Taliban released all the prisoners. Ismail Khan has surrendered in the west. Dostum has surrendered in the north. These were fighters who had stood against the Taliban for decades were surrendering like that. Everything was falling like dominoes. And so there was a real contrast to what the administration was saying to what was actually happening. And, by July, it was very clear that things were going to take a very negative direction in that country, despite what D.C. was saying.
Around that time, Colonel Mann heard similar concerns from other veterans and a very trusted reporter from ABC News about what was likely to happen in Kabul and throughout Afghanistan. This confluence of fears convinced Colonel Mann that something would need to be done to save the Afghans who had risked their lives to help our men and women in uniform over the past 20 years.
It was actually ABC reporter James Meek that got me thinking hard about what was going to happen in Afghanistan, besides what was happening with my friend Nizam. James and I had known each other for years. I found him to be a straight shooter, great investigative journalist. He was also friends with Nizam. He was getting similar concerning texts about it. And James and I did an interview kind of like this around 9/11 in that time frame of July, maybe early August. And we were talking about this. And his concern raised the hackles on my skin, because James is very slow to get concerned about things. He's done investigative journalism for so long, and he was clearly concerned. And that's when I knew, that something was truly amiss. And James and I started talking about Nizam and how he was stuck in Kabul. His special immigration visa had not been approved past the deputy chief of mission level, probably would not be. And so there was a good chance he and his family were going to be executed if something didn't happen, because if he couldn't get out of that country soon, then the Taliban were going to find him, the other commandos, the other Afghan special forces, and the odds are they were not going to take very kindly to the premier fighting force that had kept them at bay for 20 years. So, it started to register in my mind that we might have to do something to help Nizam. I started reaching out to friends in D.C., friends in Special Operations Command that were still active duty, but no one seemed to be able to do anything. And they were starting to get concerned about their friend too, or their interpreter. But there still was not what you saw with the collapse of Kabul, this just this overt, almost panic. It was just this growing alarm. By the end of the summer of 2021, late July, early August, it was like maybe we're going to have to do something in a more accelerated fashion than what we've been doing.
It's one thing to decide to help people escape. It's another thing to figure out how to execute it. Colonel Mann explains one of the first critical decisions to be made, and he describes the magnitude of the challenge in getting his friend Nizam to the airport safely.
So there was no entry into Afghanistan from our mission. No one went into Afghanistan. Everything was done remote. That's really important to point out. And the reason that I take the time to do that, because some organizations did do that, that wasn't us. We started with James Meek, an ABC reporter, 2 other Green Berets on active duty, Kelsey, the staffer to Congressman Mike Waltz, and myself. That was our eclectic little team that was going to rescue, or not rescue, but help Nizam, get across the city of Kabul. And this was no easy task. This is a Dari-speaking Uzbek, right, former commando, who's going to have to navigate a city close to the size of New York, with Taliban Pashtun-speaking checkpoints at every street corner, because they've taken over the city now. He doesn't know the city very well. If he gets captured, if he gets stopped at a checkpoint, he's done. He's going to be executed because he doesn't speak their language. Then he's got to get to the airfield and get through a Taliban perimeter there. 30,000 people thronging the airfield trying to get in, and then get a gate open by nervous U.S. Marines and soldiers, and then get on an airplane that he may or may not be manifested on. So that was our dilemma. How do you get a guy across the city like that? And oh, by the way, you're not going into the country to do it. You're going to have to do everything remote. You're going to have to accomplish all of this and be his eyes, his ears, his shepherd, his Sherpa, to move him across that city using nothing but your craft and the relationships that you've built over the last 20 years. And that's where we were.
While Colonel Mann was used to a very regimented leadership structure during his time in the Army, this effort was organized very differently. Colonel Mann says everyone worked as equals to get Nizam to safety. But it wasn't long before he learned that many other veterans needed help extracting their friends before the Taliban could get to them.
I get asked a lot, what was the leadership like inside our little group? Now, at the time, remember, this isn't a task force. These are retired folks, for the most part, and civilians, right? And so there was no chain of command. There was a singular focus, and it was on helping get Nizam and his family to safety. That was it, to help a friend, to honor a promise. And we tried to stay calm. We used our understanding of the environment, because we'd been there many times, and we leveraged our relationships, whether that was putting him in a dirty cab driven by a Pashtun-speaking friend that I'd worked with for years, or, getting him to within a few feet of the checkpoints, and then Nizam using his own craft to move around those checkpoints and talk his way through them, and then us trusting him and knowing his skill set, that he would come back on the phone when he got to a point where he was 4 feet within the gate, and then leveraging relationships that James had inside the airfield with another reporter to put him in touch with a State Department guy that was a former Green Beret that said, tell him to say pineapple, right? And that was the call sign that the Marines were listening for, and he said pineapple. That's how Task Force Pineapple came to be. Right? It was simply using relationships and singular focus on one thing, save Nizam. And that's how we did it. There was no chain of command. Different people led at different times, which is really the essence of leadership, right? Is knowing when to lead and when not to lead, but staying focused on the singular purpose. And that's how it went. And once that was done and we got Nizam to safety and his family on an airplane, then we thought we were done. But then it turns out we were getting other requests from Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Green Berets, friends of ours who said, hey, my interpreter is in a really bad way. What do you think? Hey, my former partner in Afghan Special Forces and his family can't get to the airfield. What should we do? And we decided that, okay, we're going to honor the promise. We're going to stay in this thing. We're going to open up a signal chat room. We're going to go bigger, and we're going to work together using what we had used with Nizam. But now we were going to collaborate and be each other's eyes and ears in that signal room. And then the individual shepherds could talk to their flocks, as we called them in that time of duress, and be their eyes and ears, because we knew who they were, we knew where they were, and they trusted us. And that was the value proposition that we could present to the soldiers and Marines on the other side of the perimeter who looked out at 30,000 people. Where do you even start? Right? But we could move them close in a disciplined way with their families, do far recognition signals, near recognition signals, and then move them through in a disciplined way. And that was really the value proposition that Task Force Pineapple and so many of these other veteran groups brought. It wasn't getting on the ground and moving them. It was leveraging the trust and relationships to help them move and present themselves. They're the ones that really took the risk and endured the dangers.
Right there, you heard about how the Pineapple Express was born. But how did it get that name?
Yeah, the whole name Pineapple Express came from basically one commando who used the term pineapple. He was told to say pineapple to the Marines as a password. And that we started joking about it. It became all these memes on Signal, and then it said, I guess we know what we're called. And so and then a riff on the movie as well, because that name was already out there. So, and then we started using pineapples as near recognition signals on phones, where the warriors on the inside of the perimeter could see that, and they knew it was someone that we had vetted as a former special operator, a partner that could be trusted, and they would use that to pull them through.
When we come back, much more with retired U.S. Army Green Beret Scott Mann on the Pineapple Express and the race against time to get our friends and allies out of Afghanistan. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. This week we are bringing you the second half of our profile of retired U.S. Army Green Beret Scott Mann. We're right in the middle of his description of the Pineapple Express, the effort by Colonel Mann and others to safely evacuate our Afghan friends and allies as the Taliban took over Kabul. Mann says there was some coordination with the military and State Department in order to help get our allies the right paperwork and to get them into the protection of the U.S. military at the airport. But frankly, Mann says he and other private citizens ended up working tirelessly to do the work our government should have been doing.
There was a lot of coordination, but it was coordination on the fly. The document process for the special immigration visa and the other visas was not relevant to the reality they were in. The State Department would send an email to a family and say, you have 30 minutes to come to the airfield. There was no way. There were 30,000 people between them and the airfield. There were Taliban checkpoints. It was extremely difficult for them to get to the airfield. And many of them had not, their SIV process was not completed. And for many of our partner forces, like the commandos and Afghan Special Forces, they had fought to the last bullet. They had been abandoned by their generals who took bribes. They never had a chance to put in for an SIV. So were they non-eligible? Right? They were literally fighting till the last person. And now we were saying you don't have a visa, So it was that kind of thing. And it was coordination with the military on the other side of the perimeter in the airfield to find ways to gain entry for vetted individuals that we vouched for. But it was also scrambling to fill out paperwork and submit it at the same time, which was kind of crazy because things were falling apart, and here you are typing out a visa application, But that's what we were doing. And that's what we continue to do. As of the filming of this, is to continue to just work. You have to work with the government on this. There has to be a private-public relationship because the government, for whatever reason, does not possess the political will right now to do what we're doing. And frankly, the government should be doing it. I don't want to get into this business. I retired 10 years ago almost. I'm a small business owner now. I run a nonprofit. I have no desire to go back in the Army, and nor do most of the people who are volunteering. These citizen liaison networks, we're doing it to honor a promise. We're doing it because it's the right thing. And we're doing it because nobody else is coming. But that the reality of it is we're way out over our skis on this, and this should be the government that's doing this. And we're going to hold the line until they do. So, there has to be work with the government on this. We don't want to be at cross purposes with the government. But by the same token, we're not going to sit there and watch our friends get executed and their families and their children get murdered because we didn't honor a promise. That is a moral injury that we're not willing to take on for ourselves or for our nation.
One of the biggest challenges for the Pineapple Express was the U.S. forces not being allowed to leave the airport to meet people trying to get themselves and their families to freedom. Mann says it took a lot of networking and good communication to navigate through the chaos and get people where they needed to be.
I think our work became very vital when we recognized that the U.S. forces were not permitted to leave the perimeter. They weren't permitted to push out. So then, how do you assist your Afghan partners in moving through the city with their families? How do you assist them in getting to the right gate? Because you don't know which gate's going to open. And there's thousands, tens of thousands of people everywhere. And the gate might only open for 20 minutes, then it shuts again, right? So we became their eyes and ears. By collaborating in that chat room and with discipline, we were able to share in real time which gates were open, which gates were closed, based on what our flocks were seeing from their vantage point. And then we could maneuver them with their families using that commando-style discipline that you needed in those times of duress and those times of high stakes. But also we could get the reporting back from them on what they were seeing. In some cases, we were even able to repurpose commandos and special forces to help pick up orphans or teenagers that had been separated from their families, or at-risk females who were traveling alone. So it became critical. We became, that's where the term shepherds came from. We became the eyes and ears of those at-risk Afghans who couldn't move or who were at high risk to move. And we could help them using technology and craft navigate that complexity, and then using real-time collaboration, we could exploit opportunities that otherwise there's no way they would have seen if they were just navigating on their own. Or if a shepherd was navigating on his own without that collaboration with other people and talking about what they were seeing.
Colonel Mann says there was no ranking of Afghans they were trying to save. They simply worked diligently to save everyone who was confirmed as a loyal friend to the U.S. And he explains how he and others made use of every faithful Afghan they knew to help our allies navigate the Taliban gauntlet to the airport and the mob of people outside the airport gates.
The big thing that we did to make the process work between one side of the wire and the other, the Afghan side of the airfield and the warriors on the other side, was communication. Leveraging relationships, leveraging trust, communications, and then like I said, we knew where they were, we knew who they were, and they trusted us, and so we could help them maneuver within proximity of the wall. And then you had to use some level of craft. There had to be a far recognition signal and a near recognition signal that was pre-coordinated. Once that was done, they simply got pulled through using the Harriet Tubman style underground railroad. And often this was done at night. Can you imagine wading through sewage-filled canals with your 6-month-old daughter, your 70-year-old parents, your wife, and 2 other children, and trying to execute, looking for a far recognition signal, maybe a chem light, and then showing a pineapple on your phone and getting pulled through a hole in the wall. Like, that was the kind of things that they had to endure, and it was extremely harrowing.
The Afghans seeking rescue desperately tried to evade the endless Taliban checkpoints on the way to the airport. But some interaction was often unavoidable, and Mann did not sugarcoat the pain the Taliban inflicted at those checkpoints.
A lot of how we navigated the checkpoints was basically, it was the Afghans who endured the brutality of the Taliban. I mean, if I'm being super straight, they had to go through checkpoints. Their children were beaten, their wives were beaten, and they had to endure. Or they had to wade through a sewage-filled canal or some other obstacle to get around them that the Taliban simply, it was so nasty the Taliban weren't willing to go into it. That was it. And, frankly, I don't think there's an American in the inventory that can claim credit for that. Only the Afghans and their raw courage and desire for freedom can be given the credit for that journey.
On Thursday, August 26, 2021, a terrorist attack believed to be perpetrated by ISIS-K was detonated outside of Abbey Gate. It killed 13 U.S. service members, injured more than a dozen others, and killed scores of civilians as well. It also occurred just as the Pineapple Express was completing its busiest day of helping some 500 people get to the airport.
That was the ISIS attack was a really crappy day. It was the end to what was a very beautiful body of work by volunteers across the spectrum, inside the perimeter and here at home, and a lot of courage on the part of the Afghan people, and just a desperate race to get just one more inside the wire. I think deep down all of us knew that probably something bad was going to happen, that there was no way that you could put that many people trying to get out of the country without a group like ISIS trying to cause harm. And we were working it right up until the very end. Afghans were wading through the canals. We were trying to help several young girls who had become separated, and we were trying to find them. And then the bomb went off. And, for us here in the States, it was simply silence, and the words that came across the screen that make your blood turn to ice, which is there's been an explosion. And I think we all knew in that moment that there had been a lot of deaths. There's no way there couldn't be. And I knew at that moment that it was over. There was nobody else getting into that airfield, at least not at-risk Afghans. That was it. And that there was going to have to be a whole new approach to how we did this, and a whole lot of people were going to be left behind.
4 days later, the U.S. military fully withdrew from Kabul International Airport, 24 hours ahead of the deadline. That early departure was also difficult for Colonel Mann and his friends to watch.
I was disappointed when they left early. I feel like we could have, I feel like in particular the partnered Afghan Special Operations Forces were left high and dry. I don't feel like there was a concerted effort to pull them in, and there should have been. These were, specifically elite forces who had fought to the bitter end, and they were betrayed by their generals. They were betrayed by their president, and frankly, we left them too. And I was really disappointed that because there was actually efforts underway by volunteers who had them very organized and ready to go. They could have been driven in buses, and they were left there. They were left there in a way that it's not what you do. We could have pulled more American citizens in. I think a lot of American citizens were sleeping in the streets, waiting for gates to open that never opened. They were enduring abuse from the Taliban that they should never have had to endure. And that 24-hour ahead of time departure was an ill-advised move. It left too many American citizens behind, and it left at-risk Afghans in the lurch that could have been pulled in, particularly the partnered Special Operations Forces that now presents a national security risk to the United States and to the world if they're captured.
The U.S. military might be gone from Afghanistan, but Colonel Mann says the private efforts to rescue Afghans are still very active.
There are a ton of volunteer veterans who are still working to get their friends out. And, it's very much happening. It's going to happen well into the winter. In a lot of ways, we have to ask ourselves, how does this end? It's like being on the world's longest 911 call, with no help coming. And how does that end? I don't know. But I know that they're still at it, and we're not going anywhere. We're going to honor that promise any way we can.
Colonel Mann says he can't get too specific on how those efforts look today, but he says things are getting very desperate for those still in hiding. And he says Americans will need to help them when and if they can ever get out of the country.
I can't really talk a lot about how people are being evacuated now because it's so sensitive and so difficult. And what I will say is that there is still an extreme desire to help people. Right now the focus is on immediate safety. How do you get people out of harm's way? How do they make it through the winter? From a humanitarian perspective, the winters in Afghanistan are terribly harsh. Many of these people have sold their homes, their cars, they've expended all their cash. They're living in abject poverty, moving from house to house. Some of the finest soldiers that ever lived are now running around the country like common criminals. And so just keeping them alive is going to be a Herculean humanitarian requirement that will require the help of the American people. It will require donations. It will require volunteerism. And I think, don't forget about the ones that have already made it here. How do we help them reintegrate back into the communities and connect at a level that they feel like they're part of something special and not isolated? So there's going to be a ton of work with the private sector and our communities and our citizens to do, and I hope people that will step into it.
The reason for the ongoing desperation is clear. Despite what Taliban leaders say in the media about forgiving former enemies, Colonel Mann says these radicals have every intention of killing every American ally they can find.
As of the filming of this, the Taliban are actively hunting and executing partnered special operations forces and at-risk Afghans. We know this to be true. We have footage of it. We have proof of it. To what degree that will continue, I don't know, but right now it is a very dire situation.
Upon the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, Secretary of State Antony Blinken insisted that anyone who wanted to leave Afghanistan would be permitted by the Taliban to do so. Colonel Mann says the few who are still getting out are going through misery at the hands of the Taliban. And he also says that commitment to freedom of travel does not apply to most people who want to leave.
I know that there have been claims that the Taliban allow freedom of travel, and I think there's been some evidence of that. They've allowed some American citizens to leave, some SIV holders to leave. They've been beaten, many of them in the process. I think that there are a large percentage of the at-risk Afghan population that will not be allowed to leave by the Taliban. They're going to be hunted and killed, and it will be the work of volunteers to try to keep that from happening.
To date, the Pineapple Express has made a big difference, but Colonel Mann says it's hard to focus on those numbers when he knows how many at-risk Afghans are still there.
I don't know that it's right for me to say how many lives we saved, because I really have to give the credit to the Afghan people and their willingness to get to freedom and endure tremendous suffering. I think they saved their own lives. I think we assisted as guides. I think our special ops volunteers and the other volunteers are to be commended. You know, these are men and women who quit their jobs. They left their jobs as teachers. They cashed out their 401ks to send money over. Many of them were severely traumatized from their life in war before. They had put that behind them, and then they re-entered that trauma just to help their friends. I don't know, I'd say between maybe 500 and 700 at the airfield over a couple of days, and then maybe a few hundred more since this has happened. We've assisted in some way. Much more work to do. There could be as many as 100,000 at-risk Afghans still in the country. So I don't want to, like claim victory on a couple of hundred. I think it's great and it'll make a difference, but there's so much more to do to honor the promise that I really want to stay focused on that.
He's been out of the service for 8 years, and in August he was suddenly thrust into saving lives in Afghanistan again. So how does Colonel Mann view what he and a handful of other Americans were able to accomplish in a very short time by banding together? He gives the credit to the Afghan people for having the courage to help each other do what had to be done in the face of tremendous danger.
What I saw my brothers and sisters do in those darkest of hours means everything to me. I mean, there was so much loss and so much death and so much injury and so much guilt. And the only comfort I take in any of it is, you know, we didn't quit when everybody else was unsure what to do. Those magnificent men and women that showed me so much years before stepped into it again. And they showed us what leadership looks like in this country. And I got to stand on some shoulders of some amazing people, and I'll never forget that.
Retired U.S. Army Green Beret Lt. Colonel Scott Mann, one of the leaders of the Pineapple Express that assisted hundreds of Afghans in escaping the Taliban and embarking on new lives here in the U.S. and elsewhere. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.